Do you want to go fly fishing and not see another person? Do you want an up-close personal experience with some of the prettiest trout that you'll ever find? And do you want to do it all while in some of the world's most gorgeous landscapes? Well, then you need to go fly fishing on small streams. This is water that's too small to float, and a lot of anglers pass it up because it doesn't offer easy casting. But these small streams are the hidden gems of the fly fishing world, and fishing them will make you a better angler. On today's episode of Untangled, I'll walk you through everything you need to know about fly fishing small streams. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone. Presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Today we're talking about the tiny but mighty power of the small stream, which, if you think about it for a minute, small streams are kind of like buffalo wings, aren't they? They're small, they're unassuming, but they're addicting, and you can eat tons of them and not get fat, right? All right, well, let's do an overview of what we're going to talk about today for this show. We are first going to define what a small stream is, and then we're going to look at why I love to fish them, so y'all get to hear me pontificate for a while about why they're so great. And then I'm going to tell you why you should try to fish them as well. And we will finish up our conversation on the topic with a description of the rigs that I use for fishing small streams and some tips for being more successful on this type of water, both at catching fish and presenting your flies. So let's dive right into it. Small streams. Well, what is it? What is a small stream? Well, in my opinion, it's water that can't really float, either in a raft or in a boat or on a paddleboard or with your little arm floaties that look like sharks. You know, whatever it is, you probably can't float them. Although, I will say, I would not be opposed to some of those arm floaties from my local small creek, because, I went for a swim in it 2 or 3 times last year. It's really slippery, and it's a really steep creek, so the water is just pushing. Even when the water gets low, it's just moving against you, and one wrong step, and you're just in the drink. And there's a couple of spots that they're like above my belly deep. So it would be nice to have those little arm floaties so I could just, when I face plant in the river, I just float on down. Anyways, where was I? Oh, yeah. What is a small stream? So you can't float them, right? If I had to put a number on it, I'd say maybe they're 20-ish feet across. Really just kind of depends on the stream. You could have a really wide stream that's too shallow to float. That's entirely possible as well. They can be pretty deep, but often your small stream is not much more than waist deep. That's pretty good depth for it. You might have 1 or 2 holes on the river that actually are, 6, 7 feet deep, but that's the exception, not really the rule. And when we think of small streams, I think a lot of us picture those little creeks that you would find back east, like this one, or maybe a more classic Rocky Mountain stream that's a bit steeper with more pocket water like this. So as we look at these types of waters, I think a question a lot of anglers might have initially is they look at this small creek and they're like, well, why would I fish that? Especially when there's something like the Madison or the Henry's Fork or the Yellowstone or the Green that's bigger and has more casting room and there's bigger trout and I can just drive right to it. And the banks are all mowed down beautifully and it's wonderful and it's easy fishing. Well, okay, the last couple parts aren't actually true. And I won't pretend to speak for everybody here, but I love small stream fishing for a few reasons. Number one, it's the solitude, and far and away that is what pulls me back to small stream fishing time and time again. And that's a big reason that I actually live where I do, because the small stream fishing is so good here. And if you can't tell, I'm really not the biggest fan of fishing around other people. I mean, I live in Wyoming, for crying out loud. There's like 3 people here, and we just got indoor plumbing. Seriously, though, a lot of anglers, they don't take the time to fish small water, so you're often going to have the whole thing to yourself. It's wonderful. Last year, we had a really wet spring, so runoff was delayed. It was really cold spring as well. And I went up to this creek that dumps into a lake about an hour and a half away from where I'm at. And I'd never fished this creek up that high. I'd fished it below the lake, but never above the lake. And I was like, I'm going to fish it today. And I went up there, It was the perfect day to fish. It was overcast. It wasn't raining. It was just overcast and just a tiny bit on the nippy side. Wonderful conditions. There were blue wings hatching. I had the whole creek to myself. The parking lot was full. People were playing on the lake, and there were a couple of people fishing on the lake, but nobody was up on the stream. Had it to myself, and I caught a mess of wonderful fish. It was all, they weren't terribly big, which is one of the trade offs you do make with small streams, is generally the fish aren't too big. We'll get into that later. But they were gorgeous, and I caught more brook trout, and I knew what to do with. I had the whole place to myself. It's wonderful. You can't put a price on the solitude for me. That's a good majority of the reason I go fishing is I want to go somewhere that I don't have any cell service, that I can just ignore everything and be alone with my thoughts, which is a scary place to be sometimes, but dadgummit, I need it every now and then. So that's reason number one that I love it. Reason number two is the fishing experience itself on small streams is just a little bit different. On bigger water, for example, you're often very methodical in how long you spend on a hole. There's less movement. You're not moving through the water as much because there's a bigger focus on getting an absolutely perfect drift in front of a trout as many times as you can, right? It's a completely different animal because on small streams, you're often fishing 10 to 15 feet away from the hole that you're looking at. It's up close, it's personal, and it feels like you're more actively involved because you're constantly high staking or dead drifting, you're maneuvering around trees, you're trying to avoid getting your flies caught. There's just a lot more action that goes into it than standing in something like the Madison and just continuously casting through this spot. The Madison's probably a really bad example for that, actually. Pick your favorite tailwater, picky tailwater, San Juan, for example, where your focus is more on get the best presentation possible and repeat that as many times in a hole because there's so many fish. Eventually, one's going to take it versus there might not be fish right here, or I might have spooked them, or a whole other list of variables that might come into it. And when you're fishing the small streams, it's so much more active and you're doing so much more in addition to the fishing. I like that. It can be a pain in the butt, I will admit, but it's a lot of fun, and I love that constant stimulation of small stream fishing. It's almost like combat fishing because you're fighting the river and everything else. I mean, just this last weekend, I was up on the river, and you'll notice when you're fishing these small streams that you have to get the right drift the first time, and it's in tight quarters, and you have very little room for error. And I noticed this firsthand. I was up Saturday and Sunday on the local small creek, and the first good drift through every hole brought a fish to the net every time without fail. There were only 2-3 fish in a hole, but that first drift had to be perfect, and you had to make sure it was perfect. And I was dodging tree branches, and there were spiders everywhere, and I hate spiders. And the river was trying to drown me. It was a lot of work. I love that active fight that you play against the river in small streams sometimes. But it's just a lot of fun. And then the last reason that I really love it is the gorgeous trout. That really is mostly what keeps me coming back to the small streams, just how pretty the fish are. They're usually smaller, like I mentioned earlier. But when I think about the prettiest trout that I've ever caught, they're almost always from small streams. The small stream cutthroat in particular are among the most photogenic fish on the planet. They're the prettiest fish that I've ever caught. It's just they're so unique and they're so beautiful. That's not to say you're not going to catch beautiful fish. A really big brown out of a nice big river, those can look really pretty. But those real pretty fish always, for me, seem to come out of the smaller water. And even though most of those fish are a little bit smaller, another good point Alex made when we were talking about this show was there's a big reward that comes from fishing these small streams and then finding the big fish that lives in it, right? Because there's always going to be a big one for the system. That's just the law of nature. It's going to happen. But when you actually catch it and put it in the net and get a picture of it, it's incredibly rewarding. I really like that point that Alex made, so I want to make sure we shared it. So let's move on now and talk about how you rig up for small streams. And this is where you are going to come to really appreciate the dry drop rig. If I haven't won you over from it, or won you over to it already with my constant talk about how it is the best fly fishing rig, and I will die on that hill. I mean, it's probably not a hill worth dying on, but seriously, the dry dropper rig, it's hard to beat for fly fishing on small streams. And for those that are watching the podcast, we've got a graphic that we'll throw up on the screen right here. But the dry dropper rig's very simple. You got your leader that goes to your first dry fly. Now, often you might hear the same thing called a hopper dropper rig. It's the same deal, but you don't always have to use a hopper. Hoppers are popular because they're big, they float well, and they can hold up heavier nymphs. But on small streams, you don't always need really heavy nymphs, so you can just get away with a regular dry fly. But you come down to your dry fly, and I like, again, I'll opt for a hopper if they're out as my top fly, and then I tie on about 18 inches of tippet, and that's where I'm going to put my nymph. Now, if the hoppers aren't out, I'll usually go with either an elk hair caddis or a parachute Adams, and I like a size 14 for both of those flies. I like that size because it's big enough to hold up if I need to throw like a size 16 nymph on. If the river's moving a little quicker and I need some depth, I can do that. But it's not so big that the fish are going to look up at it and be like, hey, Bob, do you see that giant caddis? That's like on my 600-pound life from last night. That thing is huge, right? You don't want fish to have that reaction when they see your flies. You want them to look at it and go, hey, Jim, now I think there's some food. Let's go look at it. That's the reaction you're trying to elicit out of a trout, okay? So I pick those flies, whether it's the elk hair caddis or the parachute Adams. I pick that based on whether or not I see caddis or mayflies out on the water, or if I know that they should be hatching that time of year, right? We talked about that a couple episodes ago, where knowing what should be hatching is a good tool to have in your toolbox. This last weekend when I was fishing, I mentioned it earlier in the show, I was fishing a big cicada because I could see and hear them everywhere when I got out of the truck. So the key thing here is with your dry dropper rig, don't overthink your dry fly selection. Choose it based on what you see or what should be out there. And in small streams, the fish are generally going to go for it. And I'll explain that in just a second. I explained why I like the bigger dry fly. You can size down if you're on smaller water that's very shallow, very clear, where the fish are going to spook if something too big lands on the water. You can definitely size that dry fly down to a size 16 if you need to. And you certainly should be doing the same thing if there's a hatch and you see fish actively rising. Try to match the size of what they're rising for. But in general, small stream trout are going to be more forgiving, and they'll still hit a slightly larger fly anyways. The reason they're a bit more forgiving is a lot of small stream trout are located in high mountainous areas that have harsh winters. This means that the growing season for trout, which is when there's a lot of food available, when all the bugs are active and happy, like, right now, that growing season is a lot shorter on small streams than it is on a tailwater. So these small stream trout tend to be a lot more forgiving of not so great drifts or maybe flies that are just a little bit too big, because they want to pack on the pounds for winter so they can make it through and be fine come next spring. Now, pro tip for y'all, that is not a good idea to make it through winters if you're a human, because you're not going to burn off all those pounds that you packed on, and you'll be stuck buying a new pair of waders every spring because your waders keep getting too small. Ask me how I know. All right, moving on. For the nymph that I pick to go on my dry dropper rig, it's really hard to go wrong with a caddis or a mayfly imitation. Again, you're going to base that fly selection on what you see or what you know should be hatching at that time of year. Although I am going to make a plug here for stonefly nymphs, because I think these are criminally underutilized, not just on small streams, but everywhere. I don't think we fish enough stoneflies as an angling public. But stoneflies are abundant in tons of fisheries, not just here in the West, but you'll see them over in the East. They're a high-calorie food item. Trout are going to move for them. And the biggest small stream that I've caught since I moved here to Wyoming were all on stonefly nymphs. And my favorite one to use is a Pat's rubber leg or a 20-incher stonefly. Either one of those are just fantastic options. And you can get kind of creative, too, with those stoneflies. Alex actually has been tying up a mini Pat's stonefly. So it's a Pat's rubber legs, but he ties it, I think, on like a size 12, and I'm fishing them in an 8. And when I tie them on an 8, they're the long shank hooks, so they're pretty big. And he's tying them on like a regular size 12 hook. And I looked at it, I remember thinking, I was like, fish aren't going to eat that. That looks ridiculous. And then Alex proceeded to catch like a bajillion more fish than me that day. Prove me wrong. So don't get too caught up on the nymph choices. Make sure it's a food item that's present in that stream system. It's within a reasonable size range, and you're going to catch plenty of fish on it. All right. We know how to rig up. We're excited to get out there on the water, but how exactly do you fish a small stream? Well, in all honesty, it's not that difficult. I find that a lot of anglers overthink their approach to small streams. And this is where you see a lot of folks start to think, oh, well, I need a different rod, or, well, I've got to have a 3-weight for my small stream fishing, right? Not necessarily. And I debated whether or not to get into the gear and the debate on that in this. And you know what? Maybe I will. I'll just dive into it right now. The smaller rods, like an 8-foot 3-weight, for example, that's a fantastic rod for small stream fishing. And if you're in something that's very, very brushy, that's got a lot of overhanging branches where there's almost no casting room, a shorter rod does make sense. The 3-weight is lighter, so it's going to land those flies a little bit softer on that clear, low water. But if you think back to the size of flies that I'm recommending you fish in a lot of small streams, you're throwing, like a size 14 dry fly, maybe a 16 dropper. That's not too much for a 3-weight, but a 4 is going to handle that maybe a little bit better. And again, I'm not telling you that you can only fish a dry dropper on small streams. Your small stream might be completely different. So maybe you're going to find something else that works better. But I say all this to say that the obsession with trying to get the shorter, lighter rods, it's kind of putting the cart before the horse, because I would go out and honestly, you can fish a 9-foot 5-weight on most small streams and be fine. Okay, the need for that smaller rod really doesn't come into play, in my opinion, unless you're on wide open, or not wide open, but on wider, windier spring creeks where you need a very delicate presentation. That's where the 3-weights and the 4-weights really shine, in my opinion. Now, I know some folks are going to disagree with that, but I'll give you a case in point. Just this weekend when I was out fishing my local small stream, what rod did I have? My 9-foot 5-weight. So it really comes down to a little bit of personal preference, but I didn't dive into the gear too much here, because everything that I'm talking about doing on small streams is something you can do with a 9-foot 5-weight. So if you don't have a small stream rod or a small stream setup, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. You can fish the 5-weight. And then if you get to a point where you're like, man, I love these small streams so much, then yeah, dadgummit, go out and buy your 8-foot 3-weight. That's fantastic at that point. But don't feel like you have to have that before you go out and experience the small streams. All right, my little tirade over there. Let's move on and talk about how we catch these fish. So I said that folks overthink it. Part of that's the gear. But the thing to remember is that you are still casting to those same features that you're going to find in larger rivers: runs, riffles, pools, pockets, and seams. That's what you're looking for. It doesn't change just because the water's smaller. The only difference is that the features are tiny and you're often up close to them. On a lot of small streams, you might not be throwing a cast more than 10 to 15 feet, if that, because there's just not that much room to cast. The holes are very short. And instead of doing a normal cast anyways, you're doing what I call a lob cast. It's kind of like a roll cast and kind of like a Euro nymphing lob, but literally all you're doing is you just keep the same amount of line out of your rods. You don't strip any in. You don't pull more off before your cast. You just keep the same amount of line out, and you follow your flies with your rod tip, keeping almost a tight line between your flies and the tip of your rod. And then when you reach the end of the run, you just pick that line up and lob it back into place. And you can see that demonstrated in this video clip that Alex is putting in. And it's in our masterclass video on pocket water, which I'll link in the show notes for those who want to see it. But that lob cast really is what I like to do with it is I just hold the fly line under my finger against the cork grip, and then I just keep the same amount of line out, and I don't mess with the line until a fish eats it, and then I'll strip the line in to land the fish. But that is a very simple way to cast, and that helps with getting tangled. But what you have to focus on here is the drag, because even though small stream trout are forgiving, they're not stupid, and drag is going to prevent you from catching fish. And for those who may not know, if this is your first time at Untangled, wonderful. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Drag is just the unnatural movement of your flies through the water. So the goal is to get the flies to look and move as naturally as possible. If they're dragging, that means they're being pulled through the water by your fly line, because your fly line or your leader is in a different water current than each other. So they're pulling against each other and they're creating that little wake. All right, that's what drag is. What you're going to find with small stream fishing is you're going to do most of it with high sticking your drifts. And all high sticking is it's what I alluded to just a second ago, where you make the cast and then you lift your rod up high in the air and you hold as much line off the water as possible. So the only thing ideally that you want on the water is your dry fly and then the dropper that's connected to it, because small streams, the pockets might be so tiny that if you try to make a regular cast, your dry fly and dropper are going to land right where they should, but there's such little room that the current from the rest of the river is going to reach up, grab that line, pull it, and cause drag almost immediately, so you won't get that drift. Whereas if you high stick it, you're going to get that drift beautifully. You're also going to find that small stream trout can be spookier than their big stream siblings. I'll often kneel as I approach a good hole, and I try to be aware of the silhouette I create. Alex made a point as well. Make sure you're aware of the shadows, because it will blow your mind how just a shadow from even your fly rod will spook some fish. Those shadows, those silhouettes, that often is what's going to spook some fish. And when they spook, they'll shoot upriver and spook more fish. It's just this domino effect. You want to avoid that as much as possible. So be aware of your approach. Think it out. Don't just go blundering up the river like an elephant. And speaking of elephants, the last thing to address here is the elephant in the room, which is very valid. How often do you get hung up on trees, bushes, branches, or whatever else is hanging above the water, ready to eat your fly? That's the biggest complaint with small stream fishing, and it's 100% valid, because it's a pain in the butt. It is not fun. Just a couple of days ago, when I was on the local creeks, I had one of those classic moments where I was hooked into a fish, and it spat the hook before I could get it in the net, and the flies went from the fish and shot straight up in the air above me into a tree, and I lost the last of my past rubber legs. I was pretty upset. One of the few times that I've been mad at a fish, which, what does that say about my intelligence level, that I'm mad at an animal with the brain the size of a walnut? Well, that's for the viewers and listeners of Untangled to debate. But you're going to get caught in trees no matter what. You're going to lose flies. That's part of fly fishing. That's part of fly fishing on small streams. So if you think you're going to avoid it, if you figure out how to avoid it and you never lose a fly in a small stream, I want to have you on the podcast, because we need to hear about your skills. Okay. But that is largely why a lot of anglers don't enjoy small streams. I can't fault them for it. The only way to avoid getting caught up all the time is, and this is what I have to remind myself of this a lot, because I will just see a good spot and I'll just rush right into it. You can't do that. You have to take a few extra seconds and actually plan out your cast. Look at what's around you, look at what's above you, figure out what might eat your flies, and then try to determine how you can position yourself so that your flies won't get tangled up in everything. The trick here is getting into that position without also scaring the trout, which can sometimes be a tall order, but you'll be surprised at how flexible you can be when a nice trout's on the line. The other tip I've got for you here is learning how to cast just a few feet of fly line plus your leader is a good skill to develop as well. It's not so much a dyed in the wool, like, oh, you've got to learn how to do this just like a double haul, and more of just getting used to how it feels. So just try that for a bit and you'll get used to how it feels and how to control it on your rod. You can also look at cutting your leader down in length from a 9-foot leader to a 7.5 foot or even shorter. There's no reason that you have to use a 9-foot leader on small streams. That will help keep your flies out of trees and bushes as well. And the bottom line with small water is, yeah, you're going to be taking a bit of a risk. There might not be fish in it. or they're all going to be really small. But that risk is going to pay off big time because you get that up close experience of fishing rivers like this. It makes you a better angler because you have to develop and dial in good presentations in a lot of different circumstances. You've got one or two chances max on small water because if you really bungle that presentation, the fish are going to spook and you're going to be left wondering where they all went. You can always move on to the next hole, but to get the most out of the water that you're fishing, you need to dial in that good presentation quickly, and you have to take extreme care to not spook the fish. These skills all translate to bigger water, and I know for a fact I would not be the angler that I am today if I hadn't spent so much time and continue to spend so much time on small water. All right, folks, thanks for bearing with us through that. Coming up next, we have the Q&A section of this week's show.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Miles from Massachusetts starts us off this week on the Q&A section of the show, writes in and says, over 3 decades ago, I learned to tie my first fishing knot at a summer camp. I ended up forgetting the name of the knot, but never forgot how to tie it, and it's always been my go-to for both conventional and fly fishing. Eventually, I came to think that this knot was the improved clinch knot, but a few weeks ago, I discovered that I've actually been tying the trilene knot all along. Is there any reason why I should not keep using the trilene knot for fly fishing? Now that I'm suddenly paying close attention, it seems like this knot is really only used in conventional fishing situations, at least online. The only time I have a problem with it is when tying on tiny flies that don't have a big enough eye to pass the tippet through twice. I love the pun, thank you so much. Surprisingly, these are the situations where my knots most typically fail because I have to switch to the standard clinch knot. Because of what you said in your last episode, my future clinch knots will have 8 to 10 wraps instead of 5. Maybe that will change my success with them. P.S. Diet Coke is the nectar of the gods. Miles, you're darn right, it's the nectar of the gods. Oh, thanks for the question. Thanks again for the pun. Appreciate it. So, short answer, I've never used a trilene knot myself, but I can't see any reason to not use it. I did find a resource online, though, that calls the trilene knot the 2-turn clinch knot, and it is fairly similar to the improved clinch knot, just with an extra step or two involved. So I put a link in the show notes to a video for those who want to see the trilene knot tied up. So, from that perspective, I don't think it would be a bad knot to use. If I was pressed to find something wrong with it, quote unquote wrong with it, the only real quibble I could make is that the added bulk might, and that's a very strenuous might, or not strenuous, that's the wrong word. Tenuous, there we go. It's a very tenuous might. It might add some extra drag to the fly in low, clear, slow water situations, but I don't think that's very realistic to worry about. So if your clinch knots are failing, you're right. It's probably because you don't take enough turns with the tag end around the line. That's the number one reason why that clinch knot fails. And like I said in that episode of the podcast you mentioned, I always take at least 7 turns with my tippet around with the tag end of the tippet before passing it back through the eye. That's how I make sure I've got good knots. And when I do have a knot fail, it's almost always because I didn't do that and I got lazy. I was like, 2 more turns of tippet's just too much. I'm going to only do 5. And then I lose it and I feel like an idiot. That got me thinking, though, about knots and their relative value because it's interesting because I went looking on forums and other places on the internet for info about knots, and oh my goodness, people get vigorous and defend their knots. You'd think they were defending their taste in diet soda or their choice to drive a Subaru with how incensed they get that someone uses a different knot than they do. It blows my mind. But I went looking for the info on knots, and I decided forums is not a good place to do that. So I went to the folks who are qualified to talk on the subject, which would be guides. The folks over at Orvis, they do a great series on their blog called Ask the Experts. There we go. where they ask a big group of guides about some fly fishing topics. And they did one on knots. Almost every guide in that one said they use either the clinch or the improved clinch or a loop knot to tie their flies onto the tippet. And loop knots, for those who don't know, they're what fly anglers call a non-slip mono loop, because we have to have fancy names for everything. It's the same thing as a Rapala knot. So if you fish conventional fishing, you've probably seen that. The idea behind a loop knot is that it lets the fly move with a bit more freedom. It gives it a bit more of a lifelike appearance, and that matters when you're using bigger bugs and bigger tippet, in my opinion. Streamers and big nymphs benefit from the loop knots, although one guy did mention that he uses it for everything and never has it fail, so take that for what it's worth. I will link that article in the show notes for those who are interested in more info on the knots, but I think we default to the clinch in the fly fishing community because it's effective, it's simple, and honestly, I'd recommend to every angler just perfect that knot and quit worrying. The hand wringing I saw on the internet over knots really just blew me away. Couldn't believe it. Of all the things in fly fishing to get so uppity about, we're going to pick our knots, really? Just didn't make any sense to me. Because almost every guide I've ever fished with uses the clinch knot. If it's good enough for them, it darn well better be good enough for the rest of us, right? So don't worry about other knots. Use the clinch, move on. Your life will be great, I promise. And Miles, thank you so much for sending that question in. I appreciate it. Doug from California has our next question, writes in and says, Spencer, great information on your channel. I've learned so much from you. I've been working on learning to fish my nymphs at different depths in the water column. I'm still not sure how to accomplish this. In addition, I struggle with emergers and cripples when I see fish rising, but won't take my dry fly on the surface. Should I use weighted or unweighted emergers? What about fluorocarbon tippet to help sink it? Also, what about the use of floatants on emergers and cripples? Your help is much appreciated. Thanks, Doug. Great questions. Thank you so much. Let's take them one by one. Just dive into it here. So if you're setting up a nymph rig with two nymphs under an indicator, because you talked about you're having an issue fishing your nymphs at different depths in the water column. So we'll just start there, very basic. Then with that two nymph under an indicator rig, you need to focus on getting that bottom fly in your rig just about to the bottom of the river. When I set up a nymph rig, I always start out deeper than I think I need, and then I adjust from there. So if I like to take the depth of the water, and it's usually just a guess. I'm not out there like measuring it or anything. You certainly could, but that's overkill. All right. If you're doing that, I'll tip my hat to you and you can keep fishing. But I'll take the depth of the water, what I guess the depth is, and then I add 3 feet to that. So if I'm fishing a run, it looks like it's 2 feet deep, then I'll put my indicator at least 5 feet above my first fly. I do that to compensate for the speed of the water because your flies aren't just going to drop straight down unless you're fishing with concrete. Then they might, but even then they might drift a little bit. You'll be surprised at what water can do to your flies. So again, I've got my indicator at least 5 feet above my first fly, and then I tie 18 inches of tippet to that fly, and that's where I put my second nymph on. And I start throwing it out there, drifting it through. If I need split shot, if I'm not ticking the bottom at all, that's when you add some split shot. If you do that and you're still not ticking the bottom, you're going to move that indicator, give you more depth. Okay, maybe your guess was off. That happens. But what you're looking for is you don't want to be getting hung up on the bottom every single cast. That means you're right on the bottom. You don't want to be right on the bottom. You want to be just above it. So if that happens, you want to move your indicator down like maybe half a foot. Okay, just take about 6 inches out of that zone. The goal is to get your fly just ticking the bottom, not hanging up on every single cast. That way you've got one fly right at the bottom and another about 1.5 feet above that, and that is right in the strike zone. The strike zone, for those who don't know, is the area of the water column where trout are most likely going to be feeding at any given time, and trout eat the vast majority of their diet subsurface. They're eating all those nymphs, and they're hanging out where they have to spend the least amount of energy for the most amount of food. And that is almost always that bottom third of the river because the current's less down there. They've got structure to hide around, and there's a bunch of bugs down there. So getting into that strike zone is key. All right. For a majority of nymphing, that's as different as you'll need your flies to be spaced in the water column. You don't really need to vary out of that 18 inches, maybe go up to 2 feet if you feel like you need to. But just get right on the bottom, about 18 inches above that. That covers the different depths of the water column that you're looking at. However, you sometimes will have fish feeding higher in the water column. That happens. About a month ago, I was out on one of my local tailwaters here, and you could see this fish. He was sitting in front of a rock, and you could see him eating because he kept moving side to side. His mouth was opening, but he was like a foot below the surface, and he was just eating nymphs as they shot their way up. So sometimes you will see that where the fish are suspended higher and they're following the nymphs up through the water column before they hatch into our dry flies. But if fish are looking up and taking nymphs that high in the water column and you can see them, well, it's a real simple solution at that point, a dry dropper rig. That's all you need. And even if, let's say they're 2 feet down and you only tie 18 inches of tippet, they're probably going to move to come up and eat that nymph at that point because they're actively feeding. They're going to see something. They'll more than likely move on that. Now, as to your questions about emergers, none of my emergers have weight on them. I just don't fish them with weight on them. Most emergers are designed to sit in the surface film or just below it. Now, some emerger patterns are tied to be fished deeper, imitating the first stage of an insect emerging from its nymphal state. The RS2 can be fished this way, and it's very effective at times. You can fish it as the second nymph behind a heavier one. That works well. Alex had a ton of success with that last summer on one of our trips. So you can fish some of them deeper, but for the purposes of answering your question, I think you're talking about fishing them higher up, trying to get the fish to eat off the top. So with that in mind, I don't put any floating on my emergers because I want them to just sit right there. And even sometimes if they're just like a half inch or an inch below the surface of the water, that's almost perfect. Now, when that happens, you can't see it, right? So what you'll want to do is have that emerger tied onto about 18 inches of tippet and tie that off the bend of a dry fly. So I put a bigger dry fly up front. If it's a blue wing hatch, for example, I'll have like a size 16 parachute blue winged olive, and then my 18 inches of tippet, and then I'll have my sparkle done emerger behind that. That way, if the sparkle done sinks and it's below the water surface, that parachute has turned into an indicator for me and allows me to see when something eats that emerger, because if the parachute moves, well, something ate the emerger, I set the hook, boom, and that is all she wrote. So last thing on this topic is I don't use fluorocarbon when I'm fishing dries or emergers because I don't want them to sink. Fluorocarbon line is just coated. Often it's just coated in a coating that helps it sink and stay a little bit more invisible. The nylon lines, they are going to float. They're going to be a little bit more visible on the water, but they'll stay floating, and then the fluorocarbon sinks. So I never use fluoro when I'm fishing dries or emergers because I want them up as high as possible. But thank you so much for that question, Doug. I really appreciate you sending it on in. Ryan from Nevada has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I just picked up fly fishing only about a month ago. It's my new obsession. I'm trying to catch up on all the podcasts now. My question is, what is your opinion on the lifelike flies? I'm wondering why they are not more common flies to use. Does traditional work better than the lifelike?" Ryan, this is a fun question. So I think lifelike flies are a waste of time. um, they're cool, and I applaud the folks who can pull them off. They look fantastic, but the goal of most flies is just to get the size and shape right. And if we can catch tons of fish on something like a pheasant tail nymph, why would we bother with all the intricate details of what a mayfly nymph actually looks like? A big goal with fly design is to be suggestive without being completely imitative, because it's time consuming to be imitative. And is that hard work going to pay off more so than flies like the pheasant tail that we know work extremely well? A point that Alex made when he and I talked about this topic was, think about it like it's all about the ROI. Are you going to get a bigger return on your investment for a lifelike fly or one that's just more imitative instead? There is the argument about, well, the artwork and enjoyment of tying versus just catching fish. Yeah, if you really just love tying, knock yourself out. They're fantastic. We just don't really need them. And at the end of the day, the presentation matters a lot more than the fly pattern anyways. So I would just ask yourself that question. Like, are you actually going to catch more fish on that ultra lifelike fly than you would if you were just using something that was more imitative? And I think if we knew that we would, then we probably would be using those all the time, right? We'd be advanced enough as fly anglers to go to that. And just this spring, we were on a blue wing olive hatch on the Green River, me and Alex. And we started out the morning, our guide handed me a hatch matcher, a mayfly. It looks just like the little blue winged olives that land on the water. Very much supposed to be a lifelike imitation. He hands it to me, and we fished it, and I think I caught one on that. And then later in the afternoon, I switched to a purple haze, and I caught like 12 on the purple haze. So that's just the most recent example that I could think of the imitative outfishing the lifelike. And in my experience, that's what happens more often than not. So take that for what it's worth. Again, nothing's wrong with fishing lifelike flies, tying them. I think the folks who can tie them are amazing. I just don't see the need for using them when everything else works so well for us. And with that, folks, that wraps up the Q&A section of this week's show. But don't go anywhere because we have the Live Real Life moment coming up right up. The Live Real Life moment is a new segment of the Untangled podcast where we are going to highlight the moments where you live real life, where you're out there on the water, enjoying it, having fun, having an adventure, learning something, becoming a better angler. That's what live real life means to us here at VFC. And we want to highlight the times when you get to live real life. So every week on the podcast, we will be sharing a picture or even a video if you want to send it in from the listeners. And all we ask is you send in a picture of something, the fish, the scenery, whatever, something that jogs the memory. Then tell us a story. Tell us about what you learned. Tell us about all the highs and the lows, or maybe you just want to tell us about all the big fish that got away. Whatever it is, we want to hear about it. We want to share those stories with the rest of the VFC audience. That's the point of the Live Real Life moment. And there's a link in the podcast description for you to go ahead and submit your Live Real Life moments. And I'm excited to see what we get. We already get some great stories and messages from folks in email and Instagram. So I'm really excited to see what comes our way on the Live Real Life moment. I let us off last week during the Live Real Life moment. I gave a little bit of a story and a picture. And again, for those who are only listening to the show, we'll put links to the videos or the pictures that folks send us in into the show notes so you can see it. We'll actually put the pictures themselves in the show notes so you can see those as well. Like I said, I let off last week, and this week we're going to have Alex share a Live Real Life moment with us. Then next week, it's y'all's turn. So get busy. Send those Live Real Life moments on in. And Alex sent in a picture of gorgeous tiger trout and video gorgeous tiger trout as well. And this is the story that Alex has for you guys. A couple of weeks ago, I was out fishing with Spencer on one of my favorite small streams and got off to a hot start. I had noticed a bunch of yellow sallies and golden stoneflies crawling around in the bushes, so I quickly tied on a new R&D pattern we've been playing around with. The royal flush, pretty similar in size and shape to a stonefly, and a copper john. I didn't see any fish rising, so my focus was more on the nymph. On my second or third cast, a big old cutthroat came up and smacked the dry fly. It was exciting. I moved up. A nice tiger trout ate my copper john. I moved up. Another nice cutty ate my copper john. It was wild. I felt like a genius. I felt like this was going to be the greatest day of fishing I've ever had. But then it just shut off, and I found myself fishing another 2 or 3 hours without any luck. It was a buzzkill. Spencer and I worked our way up the river. He caught a few on a 20-inch stonefly he had tied up. He gave me one, and we got to a deeper run with faster moving water and a big log down in the water parallel to the bank. It was just calling out, "There is a fish under here." I threw my dropper up at the head of the run, drifted it right next to the log. Nothing. A few more times. Nothing. Then I threw a cast, and it was closer to the log than I wanted to be. Thought it was going to snag. My dry fly went down. I thought it was just caught on the log, so I pulled the fly away smoothly, and I see a flash of a big fish's belly. My fly had been in its mouth, but I wasn't expecting it and didn't set the hook. I just stung him. Dadgummit. So I threw a few more casts, trying to get the same drift as before. No luck. I switched out with Spencer because he had a different rig on and he had no luck. Before moving up, I wanted to give it a couple more tries. I threw a perfect cast right up against the log. My dry fly went down. I set the hook this time, and the fly popped out of the fish's mouth. I saw his belly flash. I had stung him again. Call it stubbornness, call it persistence. I now had to figure out how to catch this thing. So I threw my same rig 10 or 15 more times. No luck. At that point, I just wanted to show him something different, something he couldn't resist. So I tied on a red-weighted squirmy worm I had tied up, and I changed positions from the side of the log to just below it, hoping I could get the perfect drift right up against that log. I threw one cast, it was a little too far to the right, then another, it was perfect. The fly drifted towards me right up against that log, and boom! That dry fly went down, I set the hook, and the party started. The fish took a big U-turn and started heading down the river at Mach 5. Spencer and I ran after it, trying not to slip and fall the whole way. It took a lot of effort, but we finally put it in the net. A nice, thick 18-inch tiger trout, and the best fish of the day. Spencer looks over at me and is like, I have no idea how we got that fish to eat 3 times and not spook. And then I said, it's called persistence. It was a blast, and now every time I walk by that log, I'm going to have that memory. Hashtag live real life. That was a great story. Thanks, Alex. I didn't forget about it. That was a great story. We did almost go on the drink that day. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for sending that in, and I cannot wait until next week when we get to hear a live real life moment from one of you, one of our listeners and viewers. And along that same line, if you have a question that you would like answered on the show, there's always a link in the show notes. Please go ahead and send those questions in. That's what fuels the show. We couldn't do the show if we didn't have questions from the listeners to answer, to help guide what we talk about every week here. And if you could, please take a minute to rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. That helps the show be more visible, helps us reach more and more anglers, helps us give them a better day out on the water. And speaking of getting out on the water, it's summer. I hope you're listening to this while you're driving to the river. And I hope you get out there, get out on the water this week. And until next week, tight lines, everybody.